Why, yes, I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Getting geeky all up in your podcast. It's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for pressing play. This episode is a little bit different. Actually, it's a lot a bit different because it's actually going to be an episode of another podcast called Found in the Ruins, which is a post-apocalyptic anything goes podcast. If it's post-apocalyptic, they'll talk about it. And they being Doc Benny and Boom Mike, who are the hosts. And if Boom Mike is actually Michael Stewart, aka DM Mike, who is also one of the hosts of the Save for Half podcast. In fact, if you follow the Save for Half podcast, then episodes of Found in the Ruins come out on the same stream. Anyway, they invited me to come on a recent episode to talk about Twilight 2000, which is a 1980s post-apocalyptic World War III RPG. So I really appreciate the invitation. We had a great time. And the content is basically, it could have been a Shane Plays episode in many ways. So we decided to do some cross promotion, and I said I would push it out on the Shane Plays feed as well. So here we go. Also, I want to, mention Michael Stewart. He's actually been on Shane Plays multiple times. One, all the way back to 2019 as the author of the Victorious RPG. With him and his lovely wife, Elizabeth. We talked with them at North Texas RPG Con. Then he came on a few years later with me as a guest co-host to interview George McDonald of the Champions RPG. And then more recently, he was on the episode from last July when we did a deep dive. I think we went to like 40-something, maybe more than 40 zombie movies with Chris Holmes and Mike. Great episode, a lot of fun. And there's another similar episode coming up soon. We've just got to get together and record it, where we're going to do a deep dive on vampire movies. So anyway, moving right along, we'll get to the episode of Found in the Ruins. I'll put links in the show notes for how to get to Found in the Ruins. Both the podcast, and there's a Facebook group. I recommend you check them out if you like what you hear. Here we go with Twilight 2000 and other post-apocalyptic shenanigans, including some books and movies on the Found in the Ruins podcast, episode 9. All right, and here we go. Approaching ground zero in 3, 2, 1.
Hold on to your butts.
This podcast contains spoilers and mature content.
My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
Hello, is anyone there? Calling anyone out there. This is Found in the Ruins.
Welcome, Wastelanders, to the Found in the Ruins podcast, a podcast about all things post-apocalyptic. I am Boom Mike, and my co-host, Doc Benny, is here.
Hello, everyone.
He is there, isn't he?
I am here. Check. Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. About to say, if you let the cannibals in again, I was going. And joining us to discuss the Twilight of the year 2000 is Bam Shane.
Oh, guys, you guys hear that? I think they're out there. Where's the ammo, guys? They're out there. Do you hear them?
It's over there.
Okay.
But you mean the cannibal sex cult guys?
Yeah, it's probably them, but somebody's out there.
Well,
Don't you
Ben
hear
gave
them?
them a key. Benny gave them a key, so they'll.
Yeah.
Oh, they're family now.
Yeah, well,
Well,
the
I
Fialcos were
mean,
invited to dinner with them. They seemed to get along really well, and one thing led to another, and
So if the apocalypse is a rockin', don't bother knocking.
yeah.
fair
on
enough. Fair
Okay.
enough.
All right.
Or if you smell ribs.
Mm-mm.
Mm-mm.
Wow.
Hey, I don't want to hear it. You and Doc J were ganging up on me on the cannibalism bit, but anyway.
Yeah. The other white meat.
Listen,
Yep.
barbecue sauce solves a lot of problems. That's all I've got to say.
Barbecue sauce.
Oh no. But anyway, so we're going to talk post-apocalyptic role-playing games in general, and the game Twilight 2000 in particular. Most notably because Doc, Benny, and I never actually played or owned Twilight 2000, so it was always one of those games that you saw advertised in Dragon magazine and thought, that it looks cool, but we'll talk about it.
Yeah, we will. Yeah.
But before we do, we have our tradition of no emails.
No emails.
So,
I actually sent
sad.
you guys an email, but I didn't expect to read it on this podcast because it was a long screed about Dawn versus Dawn.
Well, to be fair,
well, everyone's entitled to their own wrong opinion.
listen. To be fair, after the episode about cannibalism, I feel like we lost a lot of people. So we're just lucky to have a guest today. Let's just move on.
At all. Yeah. So, I mean, are you being serious? You really think people bailed after the cannibalism
No.
episode?
Well,
or?
I mean-
oh, okay. All right, good.
We only had 4 listeners before, and so it wasn't like we had a far
Take one
distance to
down.
go.
Put him on the grill. 3 listeners left for the
To go.
podcast.
Right. Yeah. The super shorthand. I kept, this was the thing I kept trying to post to the Facebook group, Mike, but for some
Oh,
reason,
that wasn't working.
anything else I
we
can
don't know what's
pin-
up with that.
anything else I can post, but that one keeps going into declined or pending. I think I'm giving the Facebook algorithm too much credit for being nuanced, but I do mention the zombie baby in the remake of Dawn of the Dead. Maybe it objected to that. I don't know. The short and long of it is that, I mean, obviously Romero's is the far, far superior movie, and Zack Snyder makes good action movies,
And it was a great action movie.
it was a great action movie, and there was a mall and there were zombies, but other than that, there's no comparison. That was the long and short of it.
Okay. Well, now we'll discuss our latest post-apoc movie and book.
Your new book is called The End of the World. Now, can you tell us when it's going to be, or do we have to buy the book?
And we'll start with me.
All right.
Movie. I actually did not watch a post-apocalyptic movie. I meant to start on the Fallout series, but things happened and I just didn't get to it. So I was bad. However, for a book, I reread Metro 2033 by Dmitry Glukovsky. It is interesting because it's a post-apocalyptic book set in Russia. It is 20 years after a nuclear war, which happened in 2013, and the survivors are all living in the Moscow Metro. And the various stations are almost like little city-states that trade with each other. They have like mushroom farms and all sorts of other things. And the main character is Artyom. He was 4 years old when the war happened, so he's like 24 now, and he's traveling from station to station to try to get some help for his home station, which is under attack by a type of mutant called the Dark Ones, which come in from the surface. As it goes on, you get a little more information on the various stations, and it's really interesting. I always enjoy, as I've said before on the show, about how other nations and cultures view the post-apoc. all too often as Americans, we tend to hit Anglo-American, Canadian, kind of Australian post-apoc. And, we don't really get much of the rest of the world's view of a post-apocalypse. Of course, there are certain portions of the world that when you say apocalypse, they say Tuesday.
Right.
So
yeah, they're living. I mean, not to make light of it, but they're living
No.
almost. Yeah, right.
there are places that could literally be considered society has broken down and it's chaos and gangs and warlords and
You know what always encourages me about that, though? The ingenuity that people come up with to keep going. Like that, I mean, you read about like warlords or whatever have ravaged, and you read about people's willing to move on, to survive, and the incredible ingenuity they come up with in doing so. So I'm not wishing that anybody would go through that in order to display the ingenuity, but it gives me hope that,
yeah,
if stuff ever does hit the fan, that, people are more durable and clever than we give them credit for.
yeah. And people are more willing to work together than I think we are frequently
Yeah, I
willing
think so too.
to give
Yeah,
credit
I think
to.
so.
But then the lone survivor, you get that whole Western / drama thing going on.
Right.
But anyway, Metro 2033 has some nifty parts of it. And there's a war, but they never discuss who the war was with. They kind of imply that it's America, but it's never really come right out and said. Some of the culturalisms that happen are a little weird. Like there's one station that is run by neo-Stalinists called the Red Line. Okay, I can buy that. But then there's also a Fourth Reich just down the way. These are all Russians putting it together, by the way.
Yeah, see, it almost sounds like Snowpiercer, where every car was a different,
Yeah,
like little community.
Kind of was.
Yeah.
So and there's trade or wars or whatever between the various stations and that sort of thing. It's interesting world building. It works a little almost Lovecraftian horror into it, though, here and there. That kind of makes you wonder, was the war really just humans shooting at each other, or was something scarier going on? So it's a good book. I've only read the first one. There's a Metro 2034 and 2035 that came out later, but I haven't read those because I want to use audiobooks because all the names are obviously Russian. And my screen reader software for like an ebook, the words, a Russian word's pronunciation is just all over the place. And, they might as well just be speaking in consonants with no vowels as far as I can tell what's being said. But the audiobook is pretty good. So, Doc Benny, what you been up to?
Well, so what I was going to say was that's actually very similar to that series we reviewed a few podcasts ago. Remember the Enclave series?
Yes.
Where book one, they're basically living in the underground and all the different stations.
The New York subway, yeah.
Yep, yeah. All the different stations have like completely different self-enclosed communities. So it's kind of a similar similar vibe to that. But
well, this came out in 2005. I don't know when Enclave came out.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. It's just interesting how they kind of mirror each other a little bit there.
Yeah. There's some good video game, apparently computer games out for the Metro 2033 line. It's also an interactive fiction or a shared fiction world. So the author is like totally okay if you want to write your own stories in that world, not in the Moscow Metro, but if you want to put it in, say, Dallas's Metro. Ha!
That's interesting. So is it a Russian author or is
yes.
it? Okay. All right.
It was published in, it was a Russian author. I think the last book came out in 2014, which is amusing because that was the book after the war should have happened, which is always the problem when you're doing post-apoc stuff. We've joked about on the show before about the dark, nightmarish days of 1982. Remember that?
Right.
when we ran out of oil and
Right.
So I looked it up. Enclave was 2011, so it's very possible that there was some influence. Yeah.
Is it set in Soviet Russia, or
No.
did it happen after? Okay.
No,
so
it's
after the
it's
USS
contemporary
it's not USSR.
with
Okay.
around 2005. Yeah, that's why the neo-Stalinists were so weird.
Well, they all had thick, bushy mustaches.
Yeah. Well, of course. Even the men.
Yeah. Nice.
But hey, apologies to our one Russian listener.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's probably like, hey!
Probably our dwarf fans too are taking offense at that. So
Well.
There's speaking of video games, there is a Russian Fallout called Atom RPG that is made by Russian developers, and it's basically you're playing Fallout, but as if it happened in the USSR. It's specifically
So
Soviet.
is it the same factions, or did they create?
No, it's totally
Soviet
it's its own
equivalents?
setting. Yeah, it's its own setting and world.
Oh,
And
that's cool.
It's dripping with Russian or Soviet
Nostalgia.
personality. Yeah, and all that, but it's I
Much
mean,
like
you're basically
Fallout
playing
is
Fallout.
supposed to pretty much drip of American nostalgic.
Basically, so flip it on its other edge, flip the coin. Yeah.
Okay, so Ben,
Yes, as I usually do, I'm going to go sideways.
cheater.
I can't. No, so I mean, I read so many very interesting books, and this one isn't technically post-apocalypse, but the main character find themselves stranded on a planet by themselves, and so it's kind of post-apocalypse for him because he has to figure out how to survive. But it's The Martian. So if you've never read The Martian, I believe it's by Andy Weir. It's an excellent novel, and there was a movie adaptation which was also really good. But basically, there's a manned mission to Mars, and the mission gets scrubbed after a few weeks. So there's a hab set up and stuff set up, but then the mission gets scrubbed because of a storm. Everyone makes it off the planet except for the one guy who gets blown away in the storm and is presumed dead. And then the entire book is basically him trying to survive and using his skills and figuring out the math and figuring out the science of basically how to survive on Mars, where, you walk outside the hab and you're going to explosively decompress. Nothing grows, obviously.
Well, of course you will. Remember, we saw that in Total Recall.
We did, in fact, see that on Total Recall. It's a very good book. The movie's also very fun. Got Matt Damon as the main guy who's stranded on Mars. It's interesting because every single time a problem arises, the author goes into really good detail. He was obviously very up on his science and math, and he goes into very good detail on how this guy comes up with a realistic, workable solution to survive another day. And so it was just really a fascinating story and a fun read. The writing style is excellent. It's very humorous while being serious at the same time. I highly recommend it. So it's not technically post-apoc on this planet, but I mean,
it's his apocalypse. Yeah,
it's totally his apocalypse. So it is definitely worth reading, worth watching if you get a chance.
I haven't read the book. I've read the movie. I've watched the movie.
It was fun, right?
The movie's very good. The best way I describe the movie is if you watched Apollo 13 and there's a little scene in there where their air compressor on the module has gone out or something like that. And these engineers back on Earth, they said, what do we have in the module? He's like, well, he's got duct tape. They've got a cardboard tube and like a rag. And these engineers cobble up that into a way to like as an air filter system or something like that. And it was one of my favorite scenes in the movie. The Martian is that for 2 hours.
Yes.
Right. It's really good. Yeah. And there's also a really good scene. I don't know. They rig up once they find out he's alive. he becomes like, the world is waiting with bated breath, and every day, how's the guy on Mars doing? And he's sort of smug that he's been on Mars long enough to be considered the colonist or something like that. Like he owns Mars or
He
by
becomes
legal law,
he
Yeah.
becomes a space pirate because he
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, by law, it's like he owns Mars. But anyway, there's a scene where they hook up where he's having a text messaging session. I don't know if it's the president or the head of NASA or something like that. But he's chatting with them, and everyone's like watching around the world. And the guy reveals that, because see, the crew that left him behind doesn't know that he's still alive. They haven't told him. And that comes out during this chat message. And he basically, in front of the world, like just cusses out the guy. He calls him, I don't even know what the word is. It's I don't want to say it just in case it's incredibly horrendously offensive to somebody, but I mean, he just lets the guy have, he's like, what do you mean you haven't told him? And all this stuff. So I like that part a lot. But anyway, good movie, great movie.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the few movies where it's a great movie, but I actually think the book is even just a little bit better.
Oh, they almost always are.
Yeah, it almost always are. I agree. Okay, and so for my movie, I watched something. It was a zombie movie, kind of, called Remains. And I guess it's based off of a graphic novel series. And the only reason I watched it was because the guy who wrote it also wrote something called 30 Days of Night, which is an excellent vampire horror movie where an isolated town in Alaska where they're entering the phase where it's like nighttime for 3 months or whatever. Once that happens, this band of vampires moves in and isolates the town, and it just starts taking over the entire town. And it's just really it's a fascinating horror movie, very well done. 30 Days of Night. And so I was like, oh, this guy wrote that, which made it into a movie. So how bad could it be? It was bad. So it's called Remains. It's a 2011 film. It was unfortunate. So the premise is that it's in Reno, and you only ever know it's in Reno because they mention it's in Reno. Like the set that they use is so minimalistic. You never see anything really except for a couple of streets and a couple of poker tables and things like that. But the heroes, if you want to call them that, are trapped inside this small casino. They barricade it, do whatever, blah, blah, blah. The problem with it is it's so forgettable. I mean, you don't even need to bother knowing their names because every scene, the main guy and the main girl, and then a second guy they save, a third guy they find hiding in there, every single scene, their motivation changes and their personality changes. And I gave it a pass because if it was based off of the source material of a graphic novel, maybe that's how the graphic novel was written, but the acting was so bad. It even had Lance Reddick making an appearance, and he couldn't save the movie. But it was so bad that it was funny because literally every other scene, a character would do something that was completely counterintuitive to what they had just done the scene before. The special effects were ridiculously terrible.
So bad it's good.
So bad it's good. But so they had a couple of interesting ideas, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. So the first was, and we'd seen this in other movies too, but the first was when the zombies aren't actively going after something, they kind of go into a hibernation mode, kind of like in The Last of Us or some of the other more recent movies. And so there's a scene where the characters are able to basically move through an entire mass of zombies that are all kind of sleeping on their feet because they managed to do it quietly enough to not disturb them. So that's an interesting idea. The next interesting idea is that at one point, some of the zombies start to evolve and become thinking creatures. And they basically, what they do is they turn on their slower moving zombies and they eat them to basically as a food source and to become stronger. And then they have to, the hero and the heroine have to basically survive against these now smart zombies that can, open doors and use weapons and things like that. And at the very end, I know, yes, right. At the very end,
I feel that way about it too. But
no,
anyway,
I know.
Go on, Doc.
So at the very end, and again, I think this is because of the source material. At the very end, one of the main characters, who has been a protagonist the entire time suddenly turns on everyone else, tries to escape, gets bitten. You assume she's dead. The other two people manage to escape, and the very last scene is that the one lady who tried to escape and you assume is dead. She comes out of the building bitten. She's obviously turned. She's got like the milky white eyes, whatever, carrying a shotgun, and she immediately goes up and like just destroys a slower moving zombie, and then kind of looks with her eyes. She's like following the escaping Jeep of the two survivors. And so you're like, okay. And again, I'm giving it a pass because it was based on a written graphic novel. So maybe that's where they had to get for it to be in line with the novel, but it was painful getting from point A to point B.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well then, Shane.
The zombies becoming like evolving has never been my favorite thing in zombie movies.
If they're listed as dead, if they're the
Right.
living dead, then yeah, that annoys me. Now if they're just infected people, okay,
Right.
fine.
Yeah, so real quick, knowing the format of the show, I do have a book and a movie real quick.
Okay.
My book, I was going to go, there's a book out there called The Living Dead that George Romero started and couldn't finish, and a guy named Daniel Cross finished for him based on his notes. And it goes from like the beginning of the breakout till way in the future. And those zombies, they don't exactly become friends, but they become sort of lethargic, and you can kind of interact with them a little bit. But instead, I kind of did a Doc Benny and wanted to do something different. There's a novel out there by Neil Stevenson called Seven Eves. I don't know if you guys have heard of it or not, but it is a post-apocalyptic movie where basically the moon shatters. Yeah, the moon shatters. They don't know why. It just one day shatters. And they have a limited amount of time I think they have like a year before this thing called the hard rain is going to happen as a result of that and basically destroy the earth. So they have to get as many people as they can up to the ISS and continue to add to the ISS. And then they come up with this system of arklets, which are these little pods where they select people from all around the world to go up in there. And so the book is in two parts. One is 3/4. It's a very long book. Don't get into this unless you like long books. I still haven't finished it. I read it in phases. So 3/4 of the book is getting to the hard rain and all the amazing, immense challenges that they have trying to get enough people up to the ISS and to have enough DNA and this and that for a survivable humanity once people can get back down there. Like they're like in 5,000 years, we can get back down there. So they go through and it's like they have to go get an ice asteroid for water. It's really crazy. It's just constant. It's like The Martian, and then it's constant engineering, but it has this, instead of The Martian is kind of optimistic. It's just almost constant. You're on the edge of disaster. And then one of the things that makes this interesting is after all of that, it jumps forward 5,000 years to where the earth is now becoming habitable again. And you see what humanity has become as a result of the very few people that survived and the choices they made. It's definitely good. I like Neil Stevenson, but like it's a long book, and I had to, like, I'm about halfway through where civilization jumped forward. And I'm like, okay, got to take a break and do something else. So, but it's a good book. And if you like stuff like, a lot of it is just, it's almost like Neil deGrasse Tyson, just telling you stuff about how space and NASA and all this works and the ISS and everything like that. So, and then in my movie, I actually just happened to watch it last night. I was going to use a different movie, but I just happened to watch it last night with my wife. We watched A Quiet Place Day One.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if any of you have seen that.
Yes.
Either of you.
Great series.
Real super quick elevator notes. There have been two A Quiet Place movies about a family living in the post-apocalypse where aliens landed on Earth that are incredibly savage, but they're blind, and evidently they don't have a great sense of smell, but their sense of hearing is ridiculously good. So you have to live your life.
No comments.
Quiet. Yeah. Okay. So you have to live your life super quiet. And there's been 2 movies of that about a family that's kind of like off in the woods on their own.
Yeah, the second movie I've got on my watch list.
Yeah, I haven't seen the second one. I saw the first one. Day 1 is in New York City, one of the loudest places on earth. In fact, they introduced the movie to saying the average decibel level of New York City at any given time is the equivalent of a scream. Now, and so the aliens start landing, right? And hilarity ensues, right? And people figure out real quick, we got to be quiet. What makes this movie interesting is the main character, the protagonist, is in a hospice and dying. And so when the apocalypse breaks out, what is somebody who's already dying? What is their motivation going to be? What motivates them to stay alive? Or what is it that they want to do? Her answer, and there's reasons for this, is she wants to go to a specific place in Harlem and have a piece of pizza while the apocalypse is unfolding. It's a good movie. I recommend it. It's a good action movie. It's kind of a horror movie, but it's definitely the apocalypse is happening kind of movie. I did want to ask, Doc, you said you saw this, right?
I saw all 3 of them, yeah.
Okay. I like cats. I like cats a lot. But the cat in Day 1 is the most chill, like super cat in the history of cats. That's all I'm going to say. I did like him, but I'm like, I don't know of any cat that's going to act like that while all this stuff is going on.
He is a highly paid actor cat, so
yeah, he's also a service cat. If there is such a thing as a service cat, he's a service cat.
That's true.
Yeah, he's her cat, I guess, to help her emotionally or whatever. Yeah. So anyway, that's my movie.
Yeah, excellent movie.
And he's had SEAL training, so
he's had SEAL training. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, he's sniping. Yeah, when thing goes bad, he starts sniping.
Unfortunately, he's sniping with hairballs, so that isn't as
it doesn't do a lot. But he's a good shot, but it doesn't make a lot of difference. Yeah, doesn't make a lot of difference.
Alrighty then, let's move into the main meat of the show then.
All right, you primitive screwheads, listen up.
You primitive screwheads.
2000.
Remember what I mentioned about giving a date for your post-apoc? Well, we'll get to that. But yeah, the role-playing industry only started like almost mid-70s, but I think it took them till like the very end of the 70s or beginning of the 80s to do post-apocalyptic role-playing games, which is kind of weird.
When did Gamma World come out?
78, 79?
That's so post-apocalyptic, it's almost a fantasy setting.
Yeah, and it's basically an expansion of Metamorphosis Alpha, which I suppose you could claim is an post-apocalyptic too. And that was 76, I think. So yeah, and of course the 80s being the time of the increased Cold War, lots of post-apocalyptic everythings. We covered the role-playing game Aftermath on the other podcast, so I'll try to put a link to it on the show notes. But as I said coming into this, Doc Benny and I totally missed out on Twilight 2000. So with me, my gut feeling about the game was always that, well, you have to be military personnel. And if there's one thing I've learned as a GM, if you try to put players in that kind of position, they're going to totally ignore you. And granted, your unit is basically disbanded at this point. You're just deserters or whatever, but still. But anyway, let me pass it over to you, Shane. You tell us, what is Twilight 2000?
Before you do that, I will just say that Aftermath followed in 1981, and then Twilight 2000 was 1984. Just to give you a chronological listing of those 4 main post-apocalyptic games.
Yeah, was by Game Designers Workshop, and Frank Chadwick did that, didn't he?
I believe so. I was looking through the credits, and the research assistants was Mr. Mark Millar of Traveler fame. Which makes sense because that was Game Designers Workshop as well.
Well, and there's some comparisons. You think about original Black Book Traveler. Of all the various fields you could go into, it was all military, merchant, or other.
Right.
And they, GDW had been a war game company. So that's where their interest in specificity was.
Well, that leads into one of my observations on this game, revisiting it, is you could completely divorce the game system from the setting and tell stories about military adventures and encounters of a certain scale, like squad level. Not even platoon level, but squad level. And when you look and you see the maps and you see the scenario that came with it.
So being a squad leader, you might say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, and I see what you're doing there. But yeah, they provide a adventure which is really more of a mini campaign called The Escape from Kalisz, Kalizz, which I'm pretty sure is in Poland because most of the background information provided Twilight 2000 is in Poland, even though the scope of the game is post World War III Europe. And yeah, you could totally just get rid of the PA system or PA setting and use this for squad-based missions if you wanted. But yeah, to kind of get back to the meat of the game, Twilight 2000 is, as one person put it, it's the Cold War gone hot. You're not deserters because the last message that you got from headquarters was good luck, you're on your own. Everything has finally, there was one last big battle. They don't, at least in the first box set and everything, they don't really go into America or Asia or other parts. This is very much Europe. Like I said, I don't even think it really gives much information on the UK or anything like that. But it's 3 years since the missiles flew or started flying. There were multiple limited exchanges, which I got to put a thumbtack in it right there. I would have still been in high school when I played this, right? It's been late 80s. And I would have had no problem with that then. Oh, there was some nuclear missiles. Now knowing what I know, only the most limited of nuclear exchanges is going to leave anything there, right? I mean, you got to have a very, very limited nuclear exchanges to have. I'm not talking about just bombing one city, but I'm talking about multiple countries launching missiles. It's got to be super limited to leave any kind of real infrastructure or any kind of civilization there. That's my personal opinion. But it's a game and it's fiction. Right. So we just take that, roll with it. As I was reading this, an episode that I would love is I'd love to hear you compare The Day After to Threads. I don't know if y'all have ever talked about doing that or not. It's like which one's more realistic for the results of a nuclear war. I think Threads is more realistic, but that's just me.
Most academic works I've read on the subject would agree with you that
Threads is awful. Anyway, if people don't know, The Day After and Threads, one of them, Threads was the United Kingdom. The Day After was American. They were basically made for TV movies of the nuclear war happens and now what happens to society. And they're both pretty gruesome. But anyway, so in this, you've had limited nuclear exchanges. Everything's all messed up, but there's still enough infrastructure and civilization in place that people are surviving in different ways. One of the interesting things about the game that the referee's manual really makes a huge point of talking about is, keep in mind this was written in 1984, so there's been a lot of games since then. But at the time, settings for games were fairly stable, right? Here's the world that you're in. But they're like, look, the most important thing for a referee, and this is straight out of the introduction in the referee's manual, it says the most important thing for a referee to remember, and that what sets Twilight 2000 apart from most other role-playing games is change. The world of Twilight 2000 is constantly changing and adjusting to the effects of the war. Most role-playing games are set in basically stable environments. The players may not be familiar with it when the game starts and have to explore the map, but once they know it remains what it is. In Twilight 2000, however, very few things will remain unchanged over the course of a campaign. A friendly village the players passed through 2 months earlier may be deserted when they return. Well-equipped and disciplined military unit encounter at one point may later be encountered as a group of marauders having murdered their officers. So they really hammer that in. The apocalypse is still unfolding. This is not Mad Max, where the apocalypse has basically stabilized. It's still awful, but things are what they are, and the new structures are in place. This is all very much in flux. So you are playing members of a army. It's specifically army, The other branches aren't mentioned, which makes sense because there was a huge army buildup. There were other branches, but there was a huge army buildup in Europe in the Cold War. And in this, you're very specifically members of a mechanized battalion of the army. You had your last battle, things went to crap, and literally the last message you got from your commanding officer was, good luck, you're on your own.
And if infrastructure and supplies are that bad, odds are you're probably not getting any jets off the ground. So the Air Force is.
Yeah, Air Force is probably a very... Now, see, here's the interesting thing. They give a lot of background on Europe, and they give a lot of deeper background on Poland. And they give I have to give them credit because they could have just said, hey, stuff went to crap, and now you're running around in it. It almost reads like a scholarly thesis or a scholarly account of from 1995 to 2000, how the tensions built up, who fired first, who fired next, what battles happened where. There's one thing that they're a little bit fuzzy on in America. I can't read anything, or I didn't see anything that showed that America directly got hit by missiles. But they do say that everything's really bad. There's a struggle between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the executive and legislative branches of the United States government to see who's going to be in charge. Some governor from Arkansas declares himself the new president. And there's just evidently at this point, some congressional leaders got their place by killing the other guy. So it's in chaos in America. And it's already back to the point where war happens after the crops have been planted and harvested. Like back in the day, war didn't happen except in certain times of the year. So society's already pushed, even in America, society's already pushed back to that point.
Mm-hmm.
Things are not good. But yeah, to your point, I doubt the Air Force is doing much, at least abroad. They may be doing something in America. I don't know.
I was thinking more specifically in Europe.
I mean, you might occasionally run into a helicopter or something like that, but...
Right, but most of those are Army pilots anyway, so...
Yeah, but it's to the point where gasoline you're basically running almost everything on alcohol. You're having to convert your engines to run on alcohol. So it's to that point where you're scrounging, scavenging, and coming up with ingenious ways to keep your stuff going. So that's basically where you're at. To talk about, Mike, you made a point earlier about role-playing games with rank. And getting players. Well, you're talking about getting players.
When you're mandated as part of an organization. Yeah.
So what they go out of their way to say here is, and in fact, part of character building is there's a formula, and I'll get to that here in a second, for everything. And one of them is to determine what your rank is. But they very carefully say rank is not between players. Rank is when you run into NPCs. So even though as a player, I'm a captain and he's a sergeant and he's a corporal, that doesn't matter among the players because some people will abuse that, right? Well, I'm the captain, so you got to do what I say. It's much more about when you run into another military organization. Okay. And I guess people are still respecting rank. It's pretty crunchy. I'll stop there and ask if there's any questions on setting or anything else before I get into a little bit of the mechanics.
I don't have any particular questions on the setting.
Yeah, no,
okay.
I'm pretty set on that too. But I will say that when you mention the word crunchy, you're going up against Aftermath here. So there's crunch, and then there's crunchies.
And then there's 2-page flowcharts on how to do combat.
On how to do combat, yes.
Yeah,
so,
I think we're going to give Aftermath the crunchy win, but it's pretty. This is a game of its time. It came out in 1984 when people were not afraid of crunch. Again, I did want to say that it comes with like a mini campaign called Escape from Kalish. And there's several things in there, and there's character record sheets, and there's vehicle record sheets. Vehicles are very important in this game. I mean, there's stats and sheets on vehicles almost to the level of...
as a game, I thought it was very interesting at how they put out so many guides to both NATO and Warsaw Pact equipment, both vehicles and equipment, which I thought would... Well, depending on your particular campaign, this could be useful in another setting.
I will say you'll have to pass on to Corbett my condolences that I did not see a ladder in the equipment list or a price for a ladder. I know he'll be sad for people who live in the Save the
Maybe
Half
they expect
podcast.
you to take it from a Polish farmer or something.
I guess. I don't know. I was
It
surprised
doesn't
because
cost.
they got equipment for everything else. As they feel like if this were a novel or a movie, really about the only post-apocalyptic stuff you're going to run into, it's much more of a survivalist prepper, almost military. Then it's not Mad Max. It's not any of that.
It's a militia.
It's militia, but you could be a good guy militia. I guess the game assumes that you're still, you haven't lost all your scruples, although you'll run into people who have.
Yeah, they're called player characters, but yeah.
Yeah.
Depending on the players, but yeah.
Most of what you're going to run into is just the effects of the war on society. There are rads. It's another thing you start. How long have I been in theater, in combat? How many rads have I absorbed? And it's more of a mechanic that the longer you play the game, the more rads you're going to absorb and the more chance you have of getting sick.
Well, Doc Benny, that's a good point. How many rads exactly would I need to hypothetically absorb in order to get superpowers?
Oh boy, it is
You
a
mean super
fine line.
vomit?
Yeah, I was about to say it's a fine line between super tap powers and super your insides are melting and coming out your mouth.
This game system's whacked. Every time my character gets rads, he gets cancer and dies.
Yeah, you're not going to sprout super muscles and leap into the air.
Well, what kind of post-apoc is this?
Your referee might take it a different direction. It might be a mix. What was that post-apocalyptic superhero zombie novel you recommended to me that I read?
Oh, X-Heroes.
Yeah, he might mix X-Heroes or he or she
Ernest Cline
might mix X-Heroes with Twilight 2000.
Yeah.
Anything's possible. So you're running around, you're trying to survive. Now, if the referee or whoever wants to tell this story, there's not this overarching meta story of we're going to put civilization back together. This is very much things have gone to crap. It's the Walking Dead TV show without zombies.
It's a group of heavily armed people wandering through the wilderness areas and ruins.
Exactly. Now, I mentioned the vehicles. Very important to this game. Vehicles and weapons and the combat, all very important, obviously. One thing, like a personal note, I first played this in the late 80s. This guy was like, hey, we're going to play this game. And I'm like, all right, I'll go play. And the more, we were like, oh, this is cool. I had never heard of a Humvee before. And the way they spell it is like HMHV.
The original
something like that.
Corporate, yeah.
Yeah. And that absolutely fascinated me. You know how like when you're a gamer or you're reading a certain genre of books, you feel like you get this esoteric knowledge that the muggles don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That was the Humvee for me for a long time. Because of Twilight 2000, I was like, I know what a Humvee is. And then they started selling commercially, in the 90s. And I was like, drat you. There goes my special esoteric knowledge. Yeah, the Humvee. I was like, what the heck is a Humvee? And they were explaining it. They were like, it's basically the new Jeep. So I was like, okay. So vehicles is important. I'll talk just a little bit about the crunch, just in case there's somebody listening to this who's like, I would actually like to play. I want to give you an idea of the level of crunch. This is one of those games, there's a lot of formulas. For example, body combat damage formula. Body combat's basically melee. If you punch somebody. So here we go. Body combat damage is determined by adding the character's strength and stature. You basically have the 6 attributes of most of the role-playing games at the time. A couple of them are a little bit different. One of them is stature, is like how big you are, and another one is education.
So kind of like size from BRP.
Exactly. So body combat damage is determined by adding the character's strength and stature, multiplying by his body combat skill. Mike, this game has skills. I know how much you love skills. His body combat skill, and dividing by 200, rounding fractions down. The result is the number of hit points the character will inflict, plus a roll of 1d6 per attack. So in the early to mid 80s, nobody would have blinked at that. But now I think there's a lot of people that'd be like, I ain't doing all that. That's pretty crunchy. So example, Bobby Lee has a strength of 12, a stature of 7, and a body combat skill level of 75. 12 plus 7 is 19, times 75 equals 1,425. 1,425 divided by 200 equals 7.125. Therefore, Bobby Lee will inflict 7 plus 1d6 hit points per body combat attack. that's the level of formulas. Character generation is going to take a while. You mentioned Traveler earlier. There's a character sheet and there's a character generation worksheet.
Does it do the terms like Traveler did, or?
Well, what they do is there's a formula to determine how long you've been in and how long you've been in combat. But it's not
Okay,
like Traveler where you keep re-upping.
Or
And
you're
every time
building
you-
your background as you roll.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Traveler, of course, being infamous that you can die or
I
get
was going to
maimed
say,
in character.
and losing body parts every time you go through a 4-year term. Yeah.
Yep.
So the back of the box says that Twilight 2000, the complexity rating is intermediate, which is number 3 on a 5-point scale between introductory and master. I'd hate to see master. By today's standards, I'd say it's a little bit more complex by the modern gamers.
Be more like a 4, I suspect.
I think so. That's kind of the crunch. Another thing that Twilight 2000 was very much known for back in the day was that you had individual hit point locations.
Like Murrow Project.
Right. You had individual hit point locations. Even Gary Gygax kind of advocated for that. I remember he's talking in one of the books way back in the day. He's like, it doesn't make sense for a human to walk around with more hit points than a horse. So maybe come up with an alternative thing like, leg versus chest versus that. But this has very specific individual hit point locations and a wound system per location. And I think it goes from light wounds to serious wounds to critical. And depending on where you're hit, if it's a critical, your chances of dying, of course, are greater. If you get an arm blown off, you're probably not going to die as quickly as if your chest gets blown through or your head gets blown off. So, and
Okay, I got a Band-Aid. It's fine.
Yeah, you got a Band-Aid. You're good. Yeah. You were talking about Fallout earlier. The TV show kind of sticks its tongue out at the video game, because in the TV show, somebody can be absolutely mangled and they just inject the stim pack little injector in them, and then they're totally fine. So they're kind of
like a potion of healing or something.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they hit them with the little injector, and they're totally fine. Leg comes back or whatever. So the other thing I want to point out about Twilight 2000 is it's hard to make this point if you didn't live it, but this is a Cold War game. This is the Cold War went hot, but all of the thoughts, assumptions, atmosphere of that is there. If you didn't live through it, I mean, some games are of their zeitgeist, right? Or of their time. And I'm not sure that let's say I'm 25 years old or 20 years old and I pick this game up. I just don't think it'll hit like if somebody our age play it.
No.
Not to say they wouldn't enjoy it.
No, or especially as a period piece. And the guy who did this actually wrote, I don't know if you've heard of it, but a game from FASA a few years earlier called Behind Enemy Lines.
Oh, okay.
It's like this, but it's World War II. It's a World War II role-playing game. And that, of course, you didn't have your army fall apart, unless I guess you're German in 45 or something. But
right.
But basically, as a period piece game, I think they could enjoy it. But yeah, there are some things you can't overthink it by going, but this logically doesn't make sense. Why would you think that way? Because we did at the time.
Right.
Is it logical? Probably not, but there it was.
2000. That was 25 years ago, but it was written 40 years ago.
I was going to say there's 4 editions out, I believe, for this. And we're discussing the first edition right now. I remember when the second one came out because I was rooming with Doc Benny in Tucson, and I remember us going to Things for Thinkers. Ben?
Yes, that is correct.
I remember going in, and that was when they were trying to release it because the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed yet, but it was well into Gorbachev's term. It was 1990.
It was about to, yeah.
Yeah, it was like I had a year left. But even then, they were trying to re-release it, trying to basically retcon the background of the game because they were having to deal with modern politics and how it had changed. I don't even know about the other 2 versions.
Yeah, I've never played anything but the first version.
So just as an FYI, you are correct. There are 4 editions that have been published. And I also looked up Aftermath. Aftermath's complexity rating is a 4. So they're pretty similar, but I think Aftermath gets a little bit of a bump because it was designed for people that graduated from MIT.
Well, and like Bam Shane just said, in that case, I really want to know what a 5 is.
Yeah, right. Seriously.
Campaign for North Africa or whatever that game is.
A role-playing game that would
Oh,
be
role play.
that.
I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, I'm sure they're out there. I don't adore and love crunch like I used to, but I still don't mind crunch. Like, bring it on. I'm fine with it.
Well, it depends on like I've said before about the Palladium RPG. I have no problem with crunch, but I have a problem with taking 2.5 hours to make a character that can get killed in the first 5 minutes. If
Right.
you're gonna make the game that lethal, you need to make quick character generation, because
I agree with that. Yeah. I
Okay,
agree with
okay. So to answer your question, here are an example of some games that have what is considered to be a 5 out of 5 complexity rating. Planescape Torment, Disco Asylum, Fallout New Vegas, Dark Souls, and The Witcher Wild Hunt.
Those
I
are all
know
video
none of
games, though.
those.
Yeah, those
Well,
are
I know.
RPG. Yeah,
Well, they're RPG video games, right? But so
Right.
those are the ones that are coming up when I do a search for a 5 out of 5.
Complexity doesn't count when the computer is handling a lot of your
That is
Yeah.
true. That is true.
stuff. In my opinion.
We were talking about divorcing Twilight 2000 from the setting. And, I did want to mention that once you're talking about, the game's about to become obsolete, which I don't think that big of a deal. People don't have a problem with parallel history games. They came out with something called Merc 2000, which is basically the same game, but you're a mercenary and the Twilight War never occurred. So just, come up with a different setting and the system is fine if you like the system. So.
Yeah, if the game system is something you enjoy.
So we mentioned Gamma World. Is there any other notable? I mean, I'm sure there are, but anything we want to mention?
Well, Gamma World's, as much 70s as 80s. It was in the 80s they tried to do the weird Gamma Marauders thing. But Aftermath, we talked about. Morrow Project, we've discussed before. Pretty crunchy. In fact, when its first edition, it was basically a skirmish war game. It really wasn't a role-playing game. It's just in the second edition they tried to retrofit some Call of Cthulhu BRP style RPG stuff to it. With permission. Chaosium gave him permission, so it was all right.
Probably the only other post-apocalyptic role-playing game I really played was Paranoia. It is PA and it's not, because you're inside a compound.
A high-tech compound, yeah.
Right, that you would never know that you're in the apocalypse.
You're in a
right?
dystopia.
Right, yeah.
But it's okay because it's funny.
Right. I loved Paranoia. That was one of my favorite games growing up. I guess there's After the Bomb. I never played that.
I was never really into Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Palladium. After the Bomb didn't really grab me.
Nothing. It didn't grab you. And of course, I'm sure that GURPS has 8 million
source
books
everything.
Yeah.
There are more. I'm sure some games we're not thinking of, but yeah, for the most part, post-apoc. I mean, there's plenty of especially NATO versus Warsaw Pact. There were war games coming out your ears from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Everything from Red Star, White Star to Red Storm Rising to the Third World War.
It was a total zeitgeist. I mean, it was a thing. Yeah. You had to be there. I mean, everybody looks back on the 80s with nostalgia and fondness, and I do too. But a lot of times I have to remember, I lived in existential fear that the bombs were about to drop.
Mm-hmm.
We forget that. But we
So did we. Well, and don't forget everyone's favorite Steve Jackson game, Car Wars, was technically post-apoc.
Technically. PA. Yeah.
Yeah. And let's face it, it was there because everybody wanted to do Mad Max. I mean,
exactly.
Let's not even
100%.
Which is not a bad thing.
Which, is nothing wrong with that. There are some things I like, but I frequently every day try to mention things it's there were things in the 80s that were not good, were bad.
Well, and that brings up one final point that I was going to make on Twilight 2000. When we talk about being of its time, it went out of its way to say that characters of both or all gender, whatever, men and women are
integrated
totally
military forces.
Yeah. And all of the combat scenarios and examples and everything. And there's nice little fiction vignettes throughout the whole, like Bobby Joe joined us yesterday and that kind of thing. And women are featured, just as much as men. So for
Well,
1984, that's pretty good.
Yeah. On the other hand, considering how the military was described its condition before the last battle, I'm sure anybody that could hold a rifle was getting stuck in near the
Right.
end. All right. Well, that has been our coverage of Twilight 2000 and the 80s RPGs in general. If anyone has any interest in us covering games in a bit more detail, drop us an email at foundintheruins@gmail.com.
Please send emails. I get really sad when I can't read them.
He does. He does. He was so sad his microphone wouldn't work when we first
So
got on here.
Do you ever think about
terrible.
going and picking a post off the Facebook group to feature? Have you ever thought about doing that?
I've thought about it, and it might come to that point. But
Yep.
since you're our only poster on the Facebook group,
That's not true. That's not true.
Oh.
Other people post on Facebook.
Oh,
I know. I'm
the
sorry.
opinions of Doc Benny are not necessarily those of Boom Mike or the podcast.
Mike, they gave up on me after the cannibalism episode, so don't worry about that.
Well, to be fair, you weren't quite as enthusiastic about it as Doc Jarrett seemed to be. I'll give you that.
I thought that was the standout episode. I thought it was good.
Doc Jarrett is definitely a connoisseur, so yes, it's quite true.
Well, I did want to say, I know you're wrapping here, Mike. I just wanted to, and this is to kind of give a shout out for Boom Mike. He's been a guest on my podcast a couple of times on Shane Plays Geek Talk. If you want to hear him talk further about apocalyptic movies, we recently did an episode about zombie movies. If you want to, it's like 2 hours long with Chris Holmes, who is the son of John Eric Holmes.
It's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, we go through like 40 movies or something like that. So just, search for zombie movies, Shane Plays Geek Talk, you'll find it. And then we're planning.
We'll have a link on the show notes.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. And then we're planning on recording a vampire movies episode fairly soon. And some of that will obviously cross over into apocalyptic type stuff.
Yeah. 30 Days of Night. I'm telling you, you got to watch 30 Days of Night.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's a good movie.
Excellent movie.
Yeah, it's a good premise. It's a very good premise.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't have to watch any movies. I'll just let Chris Holmes watch them and then he'll talk about them.
Dude, Chris Holmes is a movie fanatic.
He is.
When we have him on, my part, even though I'm the host of the show, it's easy. He sends a list of like 40 movies. I'm like, okay, let's go. And so
let's see how many we can cover.
Yeah, let's get through it. Yeah. So.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Wastelanders. And remember, always keep one hand on the steering wheel.
And the other hand on your very, very trusty shotgun.
And your third hand on your Geiger counter to keep an eye on those rims.
Tasty rims. Or rads. Mm-mm. Tasty rads.
Yeah. Hey, 3 arms. That's one extra wing.
Yay!
Wing piece.
There's your superpower mutation from radiation right there, a third hand. I mean,
third
hard
hand.
to go wrong.
In Twilight 2000, you want to grow extra limbs because that's an extra hit location.
Nice. Yeah. I've got this really huge arm. Okay. We're out.
Of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. And I feel fine.
Thanks so much for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk. I certainly hope you enjoyed this journey into the things we love. For your convenience, show notes with helpful links for each episode can always be found at shaneplays.com. You can catch the podcast in several places, including on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Verbal, YouTube, and more. If you like what you hear and would like to support Shane Plays Geek Talk, you can do so for as little as $1 per episode on Patreon at patreon.com/ShanePlays. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay geeky, my friends.